What's going on, guys? Jordan here with Universal. We're gonna go over a three-part series of hip warm-up for squatting or deadlifting. And it's gonna progress through kind of static, myofascial release, and then integrated with some dynamic stability work before we get on to the barbell, whatever we're lifting. So the pigeon pose is gonna be with the express purpose of increasing external rotation of the hip. So you sort of adopt this 90-90 position, and we're gonna center our body weight over the knee that's dressing the hip that we're looking to stretch. In that position, we're just gonna slowly fold over from the hips, making sure we're not flexing the spine to get in that position, but rather just flexing our torso over top of the hip to create relative rotation from the hip that's kind of stuck in the position of the floor. From there, we're gonna look to break the abduction-adduction plane. So we're gonna look to spread our hips apart using a frog pose. So what we're gonna do, knees on the floor. I prefer to do this from the forearm. A lot of people will do it from the hands. That usually causes an increased extension of the lower back and tilts the pelvis forward. On the forearms, what we're gonna do is we're actually gonna be able to replicate a relative hip and torso angle that mimics kind of our body's position when we're squatting. So forearms down on the ground, we're gonna make sure we tuck that pelvis underneath, and we're gonna sort of push back in our forearms into the open hip position. So the idea first would be set our knees as wide as possible, making sure the ankles are in a straight line back from the knee. On the forearms, we're gonna sort of push back into that bottom position like we're descending into the hole of the squat. This is gonna help improve that abduction-adduction of the hips. As the pigeon address rotational plane, the frog pose is gonna help address the abduction-adduction plane. And lastly, we're gonna work through the flexion-extension plane by going through a couch stretch. Now, couch stretch is a really basic way to stretch the muscles that flex the hip. Commonly, people just refer to having tight hip flexors, not knowing that there's a multitude of muscles that go through the action of hip flexion. So the primary one that a lot of people miss is the rectus femoris, which is a muscle of the quad that actually extends the knee and flexes the hip. So in this position, we're gonna try and keep the knee directly under the hip, pelvis in a neutral position, have that back foot propped up on a bench or something that's gonna elevate it to the point where we can get that knee under the hip. So now we're gonna have the knee in flexion, and then we're gonna have the hip in extension. So we're gonna address the action of hip extension to oppose tight hip flexors rather than trying to adjust a single hip flexor muscle. Some people might perceive this stretch in a different place. Totally fine. Again, based off your limitations in this range of motion is going to dictate how long you spend in this position. So to recap, the three static stretches that we're going to start off with in this three-part series is going to be the pigeon pose to increase rotation of the hips, frog pose to better the abduction-adduction of the hips, and the couch stretch to work through that flexion-extension plane. So sort of a systematic way to begin addressing range of motion of the hips that's going to be required when you're going through your compound lifts like your squat, like your deadlift. Now we're gonna go through kind of a subtle way to improve a foam rolling technique that's commonly used for the iliotibial band. So what you'll see commonly is people just sort of oscillate back and forth on the foam roller. But what we're gonna do in this variation of iliotibial band foam rolling is we're gonna use kind of some dynamic movement from ourselves rather than just relying on the deep pressure of the roller itself. So in that side lying position, we're gonna anchor that bottom foot using the heel of the top leg. So we're gonna bring that foot over, we're gonna anchor that knee position. And now, rather than going back and forth on the iliotibial band, we're gonna actually pin the point pressure of the roller on particular spots up the side of the femur. And then from there, we're gonna introduce movement from within the body. So we're gonna flex the hamstring and fully flex the quad. So bring the knee into full flexion, bring the knee into full extension. So a good rule of thumb is try and pick 4 points between the top of the hip and just above the knee. Stop on each of those points along the way. And then at each point, go through 3 rounds of flexion and extension of the knee. Now this is gonna create some movement from within rather than fully relying on the external stimulus of the roller to help improve that perception of range of motion. So something that could be painful to start, a little bit more painful than conventional foam rolling, but over time, the correction will sort of last longer, and you'll notice that pain level start to decrease every time you do this. Now Now this last one is gonna be more of a stability drill that gets us ready to get underneath that barbell or begin deadlifting. Now, it's gonna be a basic body weight lunge, but we're gonna make sure we kind of hone in on some of the finer cues of the lunge. As you'll see here as we cue the lunge, a lot of people when they lunge, they just kind of keep it very linear. So what I mean by that, it's almost like they're trying to walk a tightrope. But when you lunge, make sure you load the hips like you're loading the hips when you squat. So when you step forward, don't just step forward and then allow the knee to travel over the toe and the knee to travel in a flexed plane of the hip. Make sure we introduce that rotation of the hip, drive that knee out as we hit that kind of depth position of the lunge, just like you're gonna do when you're squatting. So what you're gonna do is take a long stride forward. Now think step forward and then sink down into the lunge. Don't worry about using your body weight to perpetuate into the next rep. So we're gonna step forward, sink down. As we sink down in that position, we're gonna look to grab the floor with the front foot by externally rotating the hip. From that bottom position, the key is to keep the sternum up. Don't have the knee shoot back into the hip. So we're gonna use that quad to pull out of that bottom position through that mid phase, exaggerate the high knee on the opposite side, and then we're gonna step forward into the next rep. This is gonna start to elongate what kind of demand we put on our hips, rather than just having the narrow range of motion of hip flexion, extension, abduction, adduction, and rotation that's gonna be required for the squat or deadlift only. So as we start to paint the fringes and build sort of strength and resiliency at these end ranges of motion, it's gonna create a buffer for us and decrease the likelihood of injury when we do start loading heavy in the narrower requirements of those heavy compound movements, the squat and the deadlift. If you have any questions, comments, make sure you leave them in the comment section below.